As always, appreciate seeing you here at the John Locke Foundation for Shaftesbury. What I'm going to talk about a little bit today is, first of all, some, for lack of a better term, shameless self-promotion. Because indeed, Carrie and I won 3 awards from the North Carolina Press Association. I'm going to explain a little bit about how this works, how on earth this happened, and secondly, what we talked about and where we are to go, where we have to go here. And Carrie is actually doing her job right now. She is covering remotely the UNC statements by Margaret Spellings about the state of the university, the annual address that she makes to the UNC Board of Governors. If President Spellings is not too long-winded, Carrie will be here to at least wave and say hi before the session ends today. Also, Carrie is, we're proud to say, a finalist for a very prestigious award. It's the Robert Novak Journalism Fellowship that's run through the for the Fund for American Studies in Washington, D.C. It's a fellowship named after the late Robert Novak. If she is going to Washington Thursday to make her presentation before the board, the committee, and if she wins this award, she will be leaving us part-time for a period of up to a year, where she is going to be working on a series of stories for Carolina Journal and also potentially for some national publications about one of the subjects for which she was recognized for the Press Association, and that deals with human trafficking. And so we're extremely proud of Carrie, and we will miss her the days of the week that she's gone, but we know that she's doing things to advance the work that she started right here at CJ, and so we're very proud of her for that. Now, we won these awards, as you will notice from the, this is all online division, so I'll get into how this happened in just a bit, which is sort of unfortunate because many of you saw on your way in the print edition that had the human trafficking stories in them. And one thing that's kind of unfortunate about the way the Press Association works is that they have divisions for print and divisions for online, and you can't enter both. You have to enter one or the other. And so the fine work of Jana and of Greg, our 2 designers, can't really go properly appreciated. So there you go. And also, before I get underway too, I'll introduce the CJers who are in the room. That would be our executive editor, Don Carrington, our managing editor, John Trump, and other associate editor, Lindsay Marcello. Dan Way, and our Dan Way, who's away from the crowd as usual, is over here, our other associate editor, standing aside the mob. So that's our Carolina Journal team, and as I say, we're all very, very proud of all they've done. So, shameless self-promotion, or humble brag, uses as the kids say these days. So here's what we did. We won awards in the Press Association contest, first experiment with animation and PowerPoint, so here we go. So first place in the online division for election and political reporting went to Carrie for pieces she did on raising the age for juvenile offenders in North Carolina, which was an initiative the General Assembly took up in the long session last year. The issue was North Carolina was the last state in the nation to try 16 and 17-year-olds as adults in many nonviolent cases. Carrie got into that issue and studied, talked about best practices in other states, talked about some of the people who had been victimized by the system, talked about how the juvenile justice system is a better place for youthful offenders, simply because there's a lot more access to counseling, there's much more access to services. The recidivism rate for people in the juvenile system is much lower than it is for people who are in the adult system. And as a consequence, the General Assembly, gradually increased the age from 17 to 18. So 17 and 18-year-old offenders for many nonviolent crimes will now go through the juvenile system rather than the adult system. And so she won first place in that category. She won third place in the online division of news enterprise reporting for a series that she did about human trafficking, once again, which you have the print edition stories, but there were more than that in the paper as well. And again, this is what she'll be writing about if she wins the Novak Fellowship, she'll be continuing to write about it even if she doesn't win the Novak Fellowship. This is something that we're not going to drop. As Donna mentioned, my awards were in the editorial division for editorials that I wrote about underappreciated stories from the 2017 legislative session, and I'll actually we'll go over all those, sort of talk about the topics that I thought didn't get enough attention. And if you want to see all those stories, all you got to do is go to the bit.ly here. So this presentation will be available on our website soon, but anyway, that's the short link that has a page with all of the stories, and you can then you'll then be able to see them, but we'll go over that more. Now, this is what the story looked like online. This is just a screenshot of the page for the Raising the Age. This is what it looked like in print. So this is the differential of having our print product and our online product. This is what the human trafficking story looked like on the website, and then also a second story on the website about this, but you have the paper in front of you that shows the print edition here. So gives you an idea there. The editorials I wrote, the first one dates back more than a year ago. The period for which this covered was, I think, November of 2016 through October of 2017, if I'm not mistaken. So the first one was something about Governor Cooper as he started office, if he decided not to go full-on Hulk smash with the General Assembly all the time, he might be more successful. Well, that wasn't very persuasive, apparently, so far. The second was about open meetings laws related to a story that Dan Way did, some stories that Dan Way did about the Military Affairs Commission in the state, which was essentially holding closed meetings, was not letting reporters cover their meetings, and didn't realize that was a problem. The particular irony of that was that the Military Affairs Secretary who had been named by Governor Cooper was Larry Hall, who was the former Democratic leader in the State House of Representatives, who should well have known that meetings of the Military Affairs Commission were supposed to be open to the public. And in fact, the head of the Military Affairs Commission said that he didn't want Carolina Journal to be in there reporting about it because we were the only media organization covering it, and he didn't want just one side to get out. That particular utterance got a couple of lawmakers threatening to revise our open meetings laws so that anyone who knowingly violated an open meetings law would be subject to criminal penalties, which is something that should happen, in my opinion. A person, many of you know John Bussian, a well-known First Amendment attorney who has worked for a long time in North Carolina and elsewhere, says we have the worst open meetings and public records laws in the country. That reinforced the point. Unfortunately, once the kerfuffle blew over, then the proposal to strengthen the open meetings laws was dropped. But that's something that we're going to continue to work on. Next one that I did was an editorial about the State Board of Elections and the uproar raised about the fact, oops, got ahead of myself here, that there were no unaffiliated members of the State Board of Elections. There are Democrats and there are Republicans. There are no Libertarians, by the way. There are three parties in the state that do have ballot affiliation. And the purpose of that particular editorial was to say, well, guess what? Where do you find members of an unaffiliated party if they're unaffiliated? There's no statewide organization. There's no place to go. The General Assembly has attempted to get around this subsequently by having the Democrats and Republicans appoint someone who is unaffiliated to the State Board of Elections. We'll see if that stands up. But nonetheless, the uproar about there being no unaffiliated voters, even though unaffiliateds are now second to Republicans in registration statewide, there was no representation. Well, there's no place to go to get an organization to have unaffiliated. So that was the purpose of that editorial. The next one that I did talked about how our budget cycle once again went through. We got a state budget, we got a tax cut, we got rainy day fund increases, and unlike other states, the world didn't come to an end. Not only a no drama budget cycle, I was able to swipe the photograph that someone took of the sand sculpture of Governor Chris Christie sitting in the beach in New Jersey where his house was. I remember that image from last summer. I should have probably brought that on here, in which Christie sat on the beach while his state went without a budget as he was in his state-owned house over the 4th of July weekend. And the final one was questions about whether a special legislative session for redistricting would have been a slam dunk for the Democratic Party. Basically in that I was stating that it would only be if indeed we had new districts drawn according to court order for the next legislative session, or a special election for the legislature that would serve only one term, which was a possibility, that things would only change if the Democrats gained control of both the House and the Senate. If they gained one or the other, we would continue to have the divided government or gridlock that we have right now. So the folks who did this judging were nice enough to give us recognition for that, and I do appreciate it. So now, the next slide, please. Come on. How on earth did this happen? How did we get here? This is where if I had my Talking Heads video, I would say, I'd do David Byrne, but I'm not going to do that. How did Carolina Journal get an award acknowledged by the North Carolina Press Association? Well, the NCPA, as with other state press associations, they have their entries judged by journalists from other states. And the part of the idea from that is you would not have peers and colleagues judging each other's work. And so, if I'm not mistaken, in this year, North Carolina's were judged by journalists in Indiana. In previous years, North Carolina would have entries judged by several states if you had several small states judging entries from a large state. So the way they work is they try to figure relatively equal population readership and then have the judgment done that way, and that way you would have less likelihood of some sort of inherent bias one way or another. So that's, again, the notion is chances are judges will have fewer biases built in if that's the case. I'm restating stuff I've already said here, so there you go. All right, now getting back to the North Carolina Press Association, there's separate divisions for print and online journalism based on circulation. There are, I think, 4 or 5 possibly for print publications. There's 1 for online, and credit for that goes to Rose Hoban of North Carolina Health News, who again and again and again said, why can't online journalists be recognized too if we don't have a print paper? I mean, what's the circulation of a website? How do you determine that? And so, thanks to her very, very relentless work, there is an online division. And there were 24 different, there are at least 24 different categories, and there were, I know of about 10 different institutions that entered things in this awards in this awards category this year. This was the first year that we had done it, primarily because this was the first year that we realized we could do it, because the online division's only been around for a few years. And then the next reason that we won is that our second humble brag is that we were one of the first, Carolina Journal was one of the first full-service nonprofit news organizations in the country. We'd done this for 22 years really, as not just being a news outlet or an outlet for information from the John Locke Foundation, but doing original reporting. We've been doing for about 22 years. But really for the past 7 years, we have kept a newsroom, staffed a newsroom to cover the General Assembly, state and local government issues and the like. And so while this is becoming more and more of a theme across the country, we were one of the first to do this. And we've been at it for a while, and I think we have some experienced folks and some younger folks too who have very rigorous standards. And so but I think that's another reason that we were fortunate enough to be acknowledged in this way. So, not too long ago, on an episode of NC Spin, one of the state's major thought leaders was asked a question: what's the biggest political problem facing North Carolina?
Tell me what you think is the biggest political problem in North Carolina today. John Hood.
Well, this may be a surprising answer, but I believe it is the downsizing of our news organizations. We've been watching this in the major metropolitan areas, but also in the smaller cities, the community papers, the small town daily papers. There simply aren't enough people actually reporting on the political news. Who runs? I mean, they will list candidates' names, but there isn't any story about who they are. This is a serious problem.
Which leads us to
Tell me what you think is the
what Tom Campbell just said. No, how did we get here? PowerPoint's not my thing, folks. Okay, how did we get to the point that the downsizing of the news organizations? Where did this come from? Well, here's something from the Pew Research Center, which does some very good work on the state of the news media every year. And as you can see, back in 1985, the paid circulation of daily newspapers was up around 63 million. And then it started dramatically going downhill to now in 2016 it was down to about 35 million. This has gone down even further subsequently. Now, why was that? Well, a lot of people want to say media bias, of course. Well, there's something else at work. Craigslist, and a decision to provide news stories for free on websites. Those are really the things that happened. What went on is that news organizations, traditional newspapers, decided that, or chose years ago, to base their model of revenue on advertising, particularly classified advertising and display advertising. So classifieds or displays, the furniture store ads, the automobile dealership ads, that sort of thing. And when Craigslist came along, when internet came along, then the revenue model collapsed completely. So there was less money available to invest in reporting and in distribution and in circulation, and because so little of the money was actually coming from the people who consumed the product, this was not a circulation or subscription-based revenue model. This was an advertiser-based revenue model. When the advertising revenue dried up, then away went the money to fund the newsrooms and then to fund the circulation. I worked for about a year at Investors Business Daily in Los Angeles, and this is one of the classic examples of a model driven on revenue, and that if the markets were doing well and the owner, Bill O'Neill, was doing well in the markets and making a lot of money, then he would print more copies. And if the markets weren't doing well, he would print fewer copies. If the word was that Bill was taking his money out of the markets and going into cash, we were all going, holy crap, we're going to lose our jobs. So that was a very direct impact of the revenue model on journalism, but that's largely what happened. I'm going to skip backward here a little bit, if you will excuse me, because we missed a slide that would explain the Craigslist effect, if you will. Print revenue was going up to close to $70 billion in 2000, and then down it goes. So that tells you the magnitude of the revenue issue. So revenue, right, and this is in inflation-adjusted dollars, by the way. So basically right now, newspapers in the United States are receiving about, once you count online, about the same amount of revenue as they did in 1950. But of course, we're a much larger country now, and cost of hiring people, distributing things, and all that is much greater than it used to be. So let me get past my, oh, okay, here we go. Now, okay, come on. Going the wrong way, sorry about that. Here. Now, okay, here we go. 2015 versus 2014, again from the Pew Center. Newspaper ad revenues declined 8% year over year. Cable TV was up, network TV was up, local TV was about a wash. Digital ad revenue was up, but at a lower level. And so as you can see, again, revenue's down. Again, advertising and circulation revenue together, estimated way down. And so that's what happened to your local newsrooms, was that there's no money to pay people. This was from the 2016 report, again, biggest drop since 2009. Circulation's about flat. So they're still selling about as many papers as they were at that time. If you take everything together, and this is from the publicly traded companies. Now, circulation has dropped subsequently, but here we go. This means drops in the newsrooms. Over a 20-year period, 40% of people in newsrooms, in newspapers across the country, are doing something else right now. I was briefly one of them because I was at the Rocky Mountain News when it closed in 2009. Here, this is something from Pew and the BLS. Weekly circulation is down 36.5% since 2004. Sunday circulation down about 35%. Employment down about 40%. So again, this has nothing to do with the perspective of the media. It has everything to do with money.
It's important to reinforce that point. I mean, I don't know if you're about to get there, but the first big newspaper chain that went under was the Conservative. So it's not an ideological thing that conservatives might want to think it is, but that does not fit the evidence.
Yeah, the Freedom newspaper chain was the first one that went under, and they published five newspapers in North Carolina. Now they're all owned, I think, by Gatehouse, aren't they? I think, yeah. And this past week, Denver Post laid off a third of its newsroom staff. Now, when I worked in Denver from 2006 to 2009, the Rocky Mountain News and Denver Post, that was the last great two-newspaper town. The Rocky Mountain News circulated 200,000 papers every day. The Denver Post circulated 200,000 newspapers every day. On weekends, the Rocky Mountain News did 600,000, Denver Post did 700,000. There were 450 people in those two newsrooms a decade ago. Now there's one newsroom with 60 people in it. So that, again, tells you, and it's entirely, I say, revenue driven. Yes, Tony?
As hard copy has gone down, is there any chart by Pew of internet circulation going up?
Yeah, but there's no revenue for, or not enough revenue for it. So, I mean, you got to pay people to produce stuff. So the newspapers will say they have as many readers as they've ever had before. They just, nobody pays for it anymore.
Newspapers do 80% of what you make goes to production.
Yeah,
So there you have it.
yeah,
Production is circulation.
yeah,
And they're not making money on the internet either, like time.
No, they never found a way to monetize.
yeah, yeah. That's right. And this is also demonstrated in sales prices too. Yes. Mhm.
Was it just an underestimating of the internet's value? Because
Yep.
it was more of a gimmick that wouldn't stick around instead of the new
Yes.
way things were going to go?
Yes, that is exactly a completely missed guess.
There's a newspaper company now I know of that still thinks it's a bad.
So that I mean, yeah. But
I also use the telegram because I think this telephone thing.
I got to work. So you can see this in the way that the sales of newspapers, the institutions. 1995, I remember the Hickory Daily Record was sold. The Royal Newspaper Group sold the Hickory Daily Record to Media General for $52 million. Well, that may have been a bad investment, but in 2004, the Rollins family were delighted to sell the Durham Herald-Sun to Paxton for $125 million, when independent analysts said that the paper was worth $70 million. Circulation in 2013 is 20,000 now. It was acquired by McClatchy in 2016 for about, I think, a bucket of baseballs, if I'm not mistaken. There was an iconic N&O story recently that is on John Trump's wall, actually, that said that the Herald-Sun printing plant is going to be converted to what? Storage units, yeah. There's going to be self-storage at the old Durham Herald-Sun building. No, I know, it's not. 2013, the Washington Post sold to Jeff Bezos for $250 million, which is twice as much, as the Herald-Sun sold for a decade earlier. The Washington Post, the news operation had lost millions of dollars for years. The Post company was making all of its money off of Kaplan, off of educational testing. And so now Bezos has invested a lot of money in digital, and I think the Post. I think the Post is one that will survive at a lower revenue level than it did before, because it's really. Bezos has been extremely inventive. But again, that gives you an idea. And then most recently, just a few weeks ago, the Austin American-Statesman sold the Gatehouse It's gone from 185,000 in circulation to 130 for $47.5 million, or less than the Hickory Daily Record sold for a mere 23 years ago. So again, so nonprofit journalism is filling in some of the cracks, not all of them, but some of them. And one of the big, the large nonprofit journalism outlets in North Carolina, I'm going to leave out some of the ones that predominantly traffic in opinion writing or who are very narrowly targeted and do a lot of opinion plus commentary. So for instance, the Martin Center does education policy only, and it's also about half and half commentary and news reporting. There are other sites. American Lens is one that does mostly commentary. There's sort of the Breitbart or the independent journalism review model that I'm going to leave out of this because they don't really have a big investment in a reporting staff, a newsroom staff. So there's, come on, please, try. There's Policy Watch, which is run by the North Carolina Justice Center. Policy Watch went from essentially two-person operation of Chris Fitzsimon and Rob Schofield. About 5 years ago, it started hiring reporters, hired some very good reporters, and covers the landscape of politics pretty well. Its perspective is a little more left of center, but still, as I said, they do a job of covering the landscape, much like we do in that regard. There is, as I mentioned before, North Carolina Health News, which covers health policy, human services, newsroom of about, I think, 3 or 4 reporters in addition to Rose. But again, that's their sole focus, is health policy and human services. There is educationnc.org, which has both a news reporting staff, sort of a center-left editorial point of view, plus also North Carolina Center for Public Policy Research is there as well. The think tank is there. I think Mebane Rash is here in the room. Laura. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. That's but they cover higher ed and K-12, and have some and as they do some very good reporting on that segment of public policy. And then there's Coastal Review Online, which is affiliated with the Coastal Federation of North Carolina. It's sort of a traditional environmentalist point of view, much like Education NC and the Center for Public Policy Research. Coastal Review Online is an affiliate with the Coastal Federation, so they're sort of under the same umbrella, but they do have different boards and different staffs and things like that. And then, what did I lose? There we go. Carolina Public Press, which is affiliated with the Left of Center Institute for Southern Studies, does investigative reporting, has a focus on Western North Carolina. They are now expanding to statewide, so they're going to be they're going to be kind of horning in on Policy Watch's territorial list. That'll be kind of interesting to see. But they've done some very good investigative work over the years. And then there's also the other model, which is North Carolina Public Radio, WFAE, which is associated with UNC Charlotte, and UNC Public Television. And the reason those are different is that they are actually operated by universities, by the university system. And this is odd, and this is something that's been a topic of debate for a while, because they were in some trouble several years ago in the Alcoa dispute about issues with reporting and the like, and of political advocacy directly. And when you're funded by the General Assembly, you do tend to have sort of a dicey situation when you're dealing with covering the General Assembly when you're funded by the same source. We have long advocated that the whole North Carolina public television, public radio should be taken away from the university, put into a separate nonprofit with a separate board. And if it is able to solicit funding from the General Assembly, okay. I mean, but that still, it should be separate and therefore more independent than it is right now. As you well know, or probably know, the two of the major public affairs programs on UNC Public Television are Front Row, Mark Rotterman's hosted show, and now NC Spin. So in other states where I've worked that have independent public operations, public television, public radio operations, there's a lot more public affairs programming, for one thing, locally generated public affairs programming, generally speaking, because I just think that it's a lot there are a lot more toes you can step on when you're more independent in that regard. As I mentioned before, you've got others like the Martin Center, American Lens, that are more heavy on commentary. Now, nonprofit journalism isn't new. I mean, political journalism for the longest time, you've got National Review, The Nation, The New Republic, The Weekly Standard, The Atlantic Monthly, all have nonprofits affiliated with them that cover some of the costs of publication. Because if you were with Reason, I should have included Reason on here, where I worked for 10 years, but I did not include that. If these publications had to charge a circulation rate, a per issue rate, that covered the cost of production, they could not be in business. They could not do it because so that way they rely on people. They rely on viewers like you to support this quality programming that you hear every week. And there's specialty journalism, National Geographic, Smithsonian, Consumer Reports. Again, heavy nonprofit involvement in journalism. As mentioned before, public radio and television. Again, supported by grants, donors, sometimes some government support, but basically supported by people who believe in the mission and support it. So why should you support nonprofit journalism, as I put on my fundraising voice here for UNC Public Television? Actually, as I said before, subscription-based pricing won't cover the costs. Reason costs you $20 a year to get. Now, there's no way they can mail that for $20 a year, let alone pay people to write the stuff, produce it, print it. I mean, they can't do that. So their costs are largely covered through the nonprofit Reason Foundation. The Insider, which is just an outstanding publication that is done by McClatchy that covers state government and provides an awful lot of the material that you will see several days later in the News and Observer or the Charlotte Observer, because the Insider wants to maintain its brand, and I don't blame them. Costs several hundreds of dollars a year to subscribe. Now, how many people really want to pay for that? A few hundred or thousand lobbyists, trade associations, other journalists will pay for that. But the public at large, you're not going to have hundreds of thousands of people paying that cost. So the Insider is a profit center for McClatchy as well. There's the public radio or the symphony or the ballet or the museum model. In other words, if you believe in the mission of an organization that produces journalism that you like, or then support it like you would a symphony or a museum or a ballet. This was the argument that my old boss, Virginia Postel, always made at Reason, is why don't you just charge enough to sell Reason? Well, we'd have to charge $150 a year. How many people would subscribe to it? It wouldn't be 50,000, it'd be more like about 3. So instead, you ask for help. Now, and then another argument is, this is a way, if you're supporting it, is a way to ensure that your beliefs are presented in a way that you find palatable. If it's an advocacy organization, for instance, or if it is a group that is slightly right of center or slightly left of center that wants to present things in ways that others don't, or that wants to cover niches that others don't. And the other thing is, ad revenues aren't coming back. There's not a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Sorry. There's not some untapped source of money that's going to bring things back. So nonprofits are going to be a larger part of journalism, and nonprofits are going to have to rely more and more on sources of money from their supporters. And here's what Pew found about digital news organizations. You've got income, which would be from things like ads, about 20%. Individual donations or memberships, some nonprofits sell memberships, about 20%. Most of it comes from foundations, and that's where you're going to find the largest percentage. I mean, the best thing you could do would be to have someone like Warren Buffett die and leave his entire legacy to your foundation. Now that would be good. Yeah, that'd be real nice, but that's not something to count on, and certainly not something to expect. So it's a matter of constantly moving forward and soliciting and working and convincing people that you should do this. So here's some of the challenges facing nonprofits. I mean, first of all, name recognition or startups. There are two organizations in the states where I used to work, the Nevada Independent and the Colorado Independent, that were formed by former newspaper and TV people. Nevada Independent is run by John Ralston, who is kind of a combination of the Larry Sabato and Chuck Todd of Nevada politics. In other words, he knows everything about everybody and has talked to everybody. And Ralston is or almost like a Michael Barone of Nevada politics, if you will. And Ralston started that when he lost his gig at the Las Vegas Sun as columnist. So he started along with Elizabeth Thompson, who is a libertarian, who had her own libertarian website and news presence in about 10 years ago. So she's the managing editor. They have a few reporters, and they cover Nevada politics. And they do it through foundation grants, some corporate sponsorships, and the like. And so Ralston's kind of left of center, and E is right of center, and and it works really well together because they're a good team. So they provide very, very balanced coverage, and that's a good thing. But they had the name Ralston there, and that made a lot of difference. Colorado Independent, started by Mike Litwin of the Denver Post, who was kind of the Dennis Rogers of Colorado political reporting, somebody really, really well known. Litwin was there for a long, long time, and some of his old Rocky Mountain News and Denver Post colleagues got together to start that. But again, they had a brand name. That's really important if you're a startup. Do you focus on single issues or do you handle broad coverage? Another thing. If you focus on single issues, maybe there's a chance, if you have a reputation, going to the next part, next thing about revenue and sources, you might well find foundations that focus on particular issues, and they might be more likely to support you long term than if you do broad coverage, where you're basically saying, we believe in your reputation because you're really good reporters and you have a brand, and we're going to support whatever you decide to do, however you decide to slice up the political pie. But that's, again, another challenge. And then there's the distribution and awareness issue. Print versus online versus a combination. I mean, we have our print product. A lot of people who have never seen this print edition, they've only seen this online. A lot of people who have seen this online have no idea we publish a newspaper, and that's a communications issue. That's an issue that we need to work on very much. But I was at a recent meeting with some nonprofit journalists, and several of them said, boy, do we wish we had a print edition. That really would increase our credibility so much. And my thought was, it can help. I hope you can come up with, a few $100,000 to print, publish, distribute, mail. That's always the challenge. Are you going to do that through a print product, which I think retains some credibility and some heft? Are you going to do it all online? And if you do it all online, how are you going to track readership and how are you going to get the word out there? What we have consciously tried to do since John joined us nearly 2 years ago, is that right? Year and a half ago? Yeah, a year and a half ago, was to differentiate as much as possible the print and the online product, is to do things daily, which might not necessarily appear in the print product, because what we want to do is take advantage of those opportunities. Okay. So how do you represent point of view in news coverage if you are someone who's saying you're straight down the line, but you're probably really not? So you do it in several ways. First of all, you do it with your story selection. What do you cover? What do you leave alone? We do not pretend to be a newspaper of record. We tried that briefly. It about killed us because we didn't have enough people to do it. The newspaper of record is what you have to do to pick up, to read. If you want to know what's going on in your state, you pick up the News and Observer. You might watch Spectrum News or WRAL or something like that. You might watch those things. Well, we don't do that, so we talk about issues that are important to us. What matters to our readers? What aspects do we highlight? So if we're talking about issues like education, school choice, property rights, taxes and budget, things like that. And that's a framing issue as well. The next is, who do you talk to? Who do you quote? What sources do you talk to? Now that makes a difference in how point of view may be represented in news coverage. How often do we return to the same subjects? Again, if we're writing a series about human trafficking, then we might, cover that issue more in depth than we would what's happening with the High Point baseball stadium. Here's Carrie Travis, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, our award-winning journalist, and Margaret Spellings was short-winded, thank goodness. Then the next question is, and this is something that is the issue not on the public radar and we're trying to elevate it. This can be especially true for specialty publications, ones that cover certain areas. The issue of rural health care is really important, and nobody's talking about it, and we want to talk about it, and we think the General Assembly ought to get involved in it. So that's one thing. Or is the issue on the public radar and we're trying to de-emphasize it? Is it something that everybody is going nuts about, and we don't really think it's very important? But it's the hot topic, it's the shiny object, you know. So that's another way that point of view is represented. And the way you do it fairly is that you make sure, in my view, you make sure that while you may have a point of view, that when someone can pick up something that you have done, and they can say, they treated this issue fairly. They covered the various perspectives. They didn't misrepresent someone. They didn't call someone a buffoon just because they had a different perspective on something. They didn't treat adversarial perspectives in any kind of dismissive fashion. They just said, this is what these folks think, and it's, you know, another perspective that's out there. So as a media consumer, what does this mean for you? Well, shrinking local newsrooms means you're going to have less coverage of government and more undetected shenanigans. And that's a lead pipe cinch, folks, and that's why supporting the continuing nonprofit organizations that do this is really crucial. What it also means is the surviving outlets are going to, unfortunately, be chasing after clicks rather than substance. I happen to love Brussels sprouts. I think they're delicious, roasted in butter. But you're going to get more ice cream and fewer Brussels sprouts. And that's something that's already taking place right now. We already know that for a fact. And so that's something to be aware of. The next thing is that the so-called partisan media, both for and nonprofit, is going to take a larger role. Some of it's going to be good, most of it's going to be awful. But we're going to be returning quite possibly to a model that was the case in North Carolina, or no, nationally, for up until about 1950, let's say. That is, partisan coverage of issues, and then you sort it among them. So as a media consumer, what this means for you is that if you're informed, if you're a self-governing citizen, you're going to have to choose many news sources, not just one, and watch out for the spin, as Tom Campbell says every week. This is, if anybody has a streaming device for your television at home, if you've got a Roku or an Amazon stick or whatever, and you know how that's different from your old dish menu or your cable box where you just see a guide to all the shows and you just scroll through it. With these streaming devices, quite often you got to click from one app to another. You got to get out of one app and go to another, and it's more work, yeah, but it's worth it because you get what you want. Now, what you need to do is you've got to go to places you may not necessarily agree with. And in fact, I encourage you to go to places you don't necessarily agree with because they're going to know stuff that you don't know, and they're going to present things in ways that make you mad, but that's okay. And they may give you insights that you otherwise wouldn't have, and they're going to certainly report information that you wouldn't get otherwise if you just stay in the same echo chamber. So I think that's very important. So maybe we're going back a little ways to my favorite American author of the 19th century, Mark Twain, who was a newspaper editor in his day. He had a lot of views about newspapers because he loved them and hated them. But he said, yes, if you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you read the newspaper, you're misinformed. But by the same token, he also said, newspaper is not just for reporting the news as it is, but to make people mad enough to do something about it. So that may be where we're in the direction that we're heading. And with that in mind, I will thank you very much. Thanks for being with us today. Be happy to take questions.